This is Today in History. I'm pleased to welcome Bonnie Abeke Thomas from the Ojibwe First Nation. Bonnie is a writer who specializes in the history of the Native people of Canada, often called the First Nations. Good morning, Bonnie.
Good morning, Joe.
Bonnie, you're working on a history of the residential schools that Native children were sent to by white settlers. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Of course. In Canada, the Indian residential school system was a network of boarding schools for Indigenous peoples, First Nations as we are now called. The network was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs and administered by Christian churches.
And when was that exactly?
The first residential schools were set up in the 1840s, and the last residential school closed in 1996. The purpose of these schools was to remove First Nations children from the influence of their own culture and to integrate them into the dominant white Canadian culture. The children were separated from their parents and their communities and taken to boarding schools where their native languages and cultures were banned. The conditions at the schools were terrible. The children were usually badly housed and fed, and they often suffered emotional and sometimes physical abuse. About 30% of First Nations children, roughly 150,000, were placed in residential schools. At least 6,000 of these students died while they were there.
What was the effect of the residential schools on your people?
Well, it was, and still is, very bad. Basically, it stopped the passing on of Indigenous practices and beliefs from generation to generation. In addition, our people have traditionally suffered from psychological and social problems, such as post-traumatic stress and substance abuse, which still persist in our communities today.